space, much like a teenager's bedroom, had become cluttered with the detritus of countless civilizations, each convinced they'd reached the pinnacle of evolutionary achievement. The Grand Assembly of Evolved Species, a name that practically begged to be acronized into something unfortunate, presided over this cosmic menagerie from their crystalline headquarters, which orbited a star specifically engineered to change colors based on the prevailing mood of its occupants. Today, that star burned a curious shade of mauve, the universal color of bureaucratic apprehension. The assembly chamber itself resembled what might happen if architecture could have an existential crisis. Surfaces flowed into one another in ways that made Euclidean geometry throw up its hands and walk out. Sound waves bounced at angles that shouldn't exist, allowing 17 different translation algorithms to simultaneously interpret 34 languages, some of which consisted entirely of pheromones and gravitational fluctuations. "The delegation from Earth has arrived," announced the facilitator, a being who had evolved beyond such trivial concerns as having a fixed shape or consistent molecular density. The facilitator hovered above what most species would call a floor, though this particular surface occasionally rearranged its atomic structure just to keep things interesting. A wave of reactions rippled through the assembled dignitaries. Some vibrated their sensory appendages in curiosity. Others exchanged telepathic comments that would have been considered rude in polite company across at least 7 galaxies. Earth? The Vausek representative, whose appearance suggested that evolution had gotten halfway through designing a jellyfish before becoming distracted by fractal mathematics, pulsed in a pattern that translated roughly as amused disdain. "Those bipedal mammals with the ridiculously inefficient digestive systems? The ones who still have separate tubes for breathing and consuming nutrients?" "Indeed," confirmed the facilitator, with the patience of a being who had witnessed the rise and fall of entire civilizations during what humans would consider a coffee break. "They have achieved faster-than-light travel and have petitioned for membership." "Those bodies?" A member of the ZCAT collective rotated several of its 17 visual organs in what passed for incredulity. "They've barely modified their basic template in 200,000 years. They're still using internal skeletons, for cosmic sake." "Perhaps we should allow them to speak for themselves," suggested the facilitator, sending a subtle electromagnetic signal that caused the chamber's entrance portal to reconfigure. The human delegation entered, walking on 2 legs in a manner that several attending xenobiologists found simultaneously primitive and fascinating. Their lead representative, a being composed primarily of water and poor evolutionary choices, stepped forward with a facial expression that exposed teeth in what their species inexplicably considered non-threatening. "Greetings to the assembly," the human said, apparently unaware that many present considered verbal communication as sophisticated as banging rocks together. "We are honored to be considered for membership in this esteemed body." The Tlakani ambassador, whose species had abandoned diplomatic niceties around the time Earth's dominant species was still figuring out opposable thumbs, floated forward. A small cloud of spores, which would have induced enlightening hallucinations in unprotected species, accompanied their equivalent of a sigh. "Your application has been received," the ambassador stated. "However, the committee has noted a significant concern. Your species appears to have reached what we call the biological ceiling." The human's face performed an intricate dance of muscle contractions that signaled confusion. "The what now?" "The biological ceiling," repeated the ambassador, as though explaining advanced quantum mechanics to a particularly dense rock. "The point at which a species has reached the limits of their base biological template, without significant self-directed evolutionary advancement." "You humans still rely on oxygen respiration," offered another representative helpfully, "and your neural processing capabilities are limited by electrochemical transmission speeds. You haven't even begun to incorporate photosynthetic capabilities or radiation resistance. Well, yes, the human replied, with a casual gesture that fascinated several attendees who had evolved past the need for shoulders. That's because we decided we didn't need to evolve anymore. The chamber went so quiet that quantum fluctuations at the subatomic level became momentarily audible. Excuse me? The Zekold representative's visual organs all blinked in sequence, creating a ripple effect that inadvertently hypnotized 3 junior delegates. We decided not to wait for evolution, explained the human, apparently oblivious to the conceptual earthquake they had just triggered. It's inefficient, painfully slow, and frankly, too unpredictable for our liking. Instead, we developed technology to compensate for our biological limitations. The assembly erupted. Species that communicated through bioluminescence flashed in patterns that temporarily overloaded the chamber's light-dampening systems. Those with auditory capabilities produced sounds that the translation matrices struggled to interpret as anything other than mathematical expressions of outrage. "That's not how evolution works!" exclaimed the Varsic representative, its fractal appendages twisting into configurations that would give topologists nightmares. "You can't simply decide to opt out of biological evolution." "Well, technically, we didn't stop evolving," the human clarified, with the air of someone explaining that water is wet. "We just changed the mechanism. Rather than waiting for random mutations and natural selection to gradually adapt our bodies over thousands of generations, we developed technology that allows us to adapt to new environments and challenges within a single lifetime." "Preposterous," declared a representative of the Krith Dominion, a species that had spent 8 million years carefully guiding their evolution until they achieved what they considered physical perfection, beings composed entirely of interlocking hexagons. "Technology is a temporary solution, not a valid substitute for proper biological advancement." The human smiled again, a gesture that several predatory species in attendance found vaguely triggering. "With respect, we see it differently. Our biological limitations became the catalyst for our technological innovation. We couldn't fly, so we built aircraft. We couldn't survive in space, so we created life support systems. We couldn't process information quickly enough, so we developed artificial intelligence. But these are external tools," argued the Tlakani ambassador, with a dismissive wave of an appendage that could simultaneously function as a sensory organ, manipulator, and quantum computer. "Not evolutionary adaptation. They started as external tools," the human conceded. "But they're becoming less external all the time. Our medical implants, neural interfaces, genetic therapies, the line between technology and biology is blurring for us. We're directing our own evolution, just through different means." The facilitator, sensing that this discussion was veering dangerously close to a philosophical debate, which, given the lifespan of some members, could continue until the heat death of the universe, intervened. "Perhaps we should consider this approach as an alternative evolutionary strategy. Unorthodox, certainly, but not without merit." "But it's artificial," protested a representative from a silicon-based collective that had evolved to incorporate natural semiconductors into their nervous systems, apparently missing the irony. "Is it, though?" countered the human. "Tool use shaped our evolution from the beginning. Our brains grew larger precisely because we started using tools. Our technology is just an extension of that same process, accelerated and directed." The chamber once again filled with the cacophony of multiple species trying to express indignation in multiple forms simultaneously. The human delegation exchanged glances. One leaned toward another and whispered, "Maybe we should have left the neural uplink demonstration for the second meeting." The assembly chambers, designed to facilitate communication between radically different species, struggled to translate the fundamental paradigm shift that the humans had just casually introduced. Species that had spent millions of years carefully guiding their biological evolution through various methods found the human approach borderline offensive. A shortcut that somehow felt like cheating at a game whose rules had been established since the first microbe wiggled through primordial soup. Yet a few of the younger species watched with something resembling interest. The myth, who had only achieved interstellar travel 50,000 years ago, practically infants by assembly standards, found themselves reconsidering their own 300-year plan for developing photosynthetic skin. The facilitator, whose species had witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations like humans witnessed weather patterns, recognized the pattern. Every few million years a species came along that changed the rules, that forced everyone to reconsider assumptions so basic they had ceased to be recognized as assumptions at all. The humans stood there, still smiling, seemingly unaware that they had just challenged the most fundamental paradigm of galactic civilization. Their biological ceiling wasn't a limitation. It was simply the foundation upon which they had decided to build something entirely different. And somewhere in the quantum foam that underlies reality, something that might be described as cosmic irony formed into existence. The species considered least evolved might just have stumbled upon the next great evolutionary leap. 6 standard galactic months after the initial introduction of humans to the Grand Assembly, a special committee convened to study this peculiar species and their unorthodox approach to evolution. The committee, comprising representatives from 12 different evolutionary philosophies, had spent what humans would consider decades analyzing data only to emerge more perplexed than when they began. "I simply don't understand," said the Eridani delegate, a being composed of specialized gas clusters that had evolved the ability to maintain coherent thought patterns through electromagnetic resonance. "They surgically modify themselves, voluntarily." The committee's meeting chamber, a modest affair by assembly standards, it only had 4 dimensions, and the walls merely shifted colors instead of phase states, displayed holographic representations of human augmentation technology. "Indeed," replied the committee chairperson, a member of the ancient Thaxal species, whose evolutionary path had involved progressively shedding physical form in favor of distributed consciousness. "Their approach appears to be modular." The projected images showed humans with various technological enhancements: neural implants linking brains directly to information networks, synthetic organs replacing failed biological ones, mechanical limbs outperforming their organic counterparts, and genetic modifications addressing everything from inherited diseases to enhanced capabilities. "But where's the unified direction?" asked a representative of the Voluth Concordance, a species that had evolved through careful millennia-long planning to optimize their biology for space travel. "They're not evolving toward any consistent goal. Some focus on longevity, others on strength, still others on cognitive enhancement. It's evolutionary anarchy." "That appears to be precisely the point," noted the Thaxal chairperson, their consciousness temporarily condensing into a more focused pattern. "They've individualized evolution. Each human selects modifications based on personal need or desire, rather than species-wide directives." A symphony of disbelieving sensory expressions rippled through the committee. "But that's not evolution. That's shopping," exclaimed the Eridani, their gas clusters pulsing in agitation. "Nevertheless," interjected a quieter voice, "it seems to be working for them." All attention turned to the newest committee member, a representative of the myth, those youngsters who had been spacefaring for a mere 50 millennia. The myth, with their still evolving bioluminescent communication patterns, had been observing human development with particular interest. "Their approach has certain efficiencies," the myth continued, ignoring the electromagnetic equivalent of raised eyebrows directed their way. Consider adaptation timeframes. When a new environmental challenge arises, most species require generations to adapt through natural selection or centuries for guided evolutionary adjustments. Humans simply design new technology and implement it within years, sometimes months. At what cost? Countered the Volith representative. Such rapid adaptation leads to instability. Their society must fragment, with such divergent capabilities emerging so quickly. Curiously, no, said the myth, displaying data streams that showed human social cohesion metrics. They've developed methods of maintaining cultural unity despite physical diversity. Their information networks connect individuals regardless of form. Their ethical frameworks have expanded to accommodate diverse capabilities. It still lacks elegance, sniffed a representative from the Chorus alignment, a species that had evolved perfect symmetry down to the subatomic level. True evolutionary advancement should reflect cosmic harmonic principles. The committee's discussion might have continued in this philosophical vein for several more standard years had it not been for an unexpected interruption. A junior facilitator, still possessing enough physical form to appear visibly agitated, manifested in the chamber. Apologies for the intrusion, the facilitator vibrated, but the human delegation has requested an immediate audience. They wish to provide a demonstration. The committee exchanged the universal expressions of bureaucratic wariness, but protocol demanded they accept. Minutes later, an almost obscenely short time frame by assembly standards, the human delegation entered. Distinguished committee members, began the lead human, we understand you've been studying our approach to technological augmentation. Rather than further abstract discussion, we thought a practical demonstration might be illuminating. Before the committee could formulate the 14 different types of objections required by traditional protocol, the human gestured, and a new figure entered the chamber. The being that stepped, or rather, glided forward, prompted a collective processing pause among the committee. It was recognizably derived from human stock, yet so extensively modified that it represented something else entirely. Instead of legs, a hovering mechanism kept it effortlessly aloft. Its arms featured multiple articulation points with specialized attachments. Most strikingly, its cranial structure had been expanded to house additional neural hardware. This is the Explorer Class Augmentation Package, explained the human representative, specifically designed for adaptation to extreme environments and unknown parameters. Over 40% of the original biological systems have been replaced or enhanced, while neural capacity has been tripled through synthetic expansion. The augmented human smiled, an expression made somehow more disconcerting by the subtle glow emanating from behind its eyes. I volunteered for the Explorer program 5 Earth years ago, it said. Before that, I was limited to standard human capabilities. Now I can survive in environments ranging from near vacuum to crushing pressure, process information at rates approaching artificial intelligence, and interface directly with any technological system. But you're no longer human, said the Eridani representative, gas clusters swirling in confusion. This depends entirely on how you define human, replied the augmented being. My consciousness, memories, and core identity remain intact. I've simply expanded what my body can do. And this is common? Asked the Thexol chairperson. This level of augmentation remains specialized, the original human representative explained. But basic enhancements are becoming standard. Neural interfaces for information access, genetic optimizations, modest physical augmentations, these are increasingly routine. Different human communities are developing specialized adaptation paths based on their environments and needs. The committee displayed the full spectrum of reactions that translate across species as stunned disbelief. But how do you maintain cohesion as a species? demanded the Voluth representative. "What prevents fragmentation into different subspecies?" "That was an early concern," acknowledged the human. "Our solution was to develop both technological and social systems that ensure continuity despite diversity. Shared information networks create cultural cohesion. Universal interface standards allow communication regardless of augmentation type. And fundamentally, we've expanded our definition of humanity to include all our variations. It's evolutionary divergence without speciation," observed the myth representative, earning disapproving vibrational patterns from the more traditional committee members. "Precisely," agreed the augmented human. "We don't need biological evolution to speciate anymore. We can simultaneously diversify and remain unified through technological means." "But what of your unmodified population?" asked the chorus representative. "Those who reject augmentation?" "They remain fully valued members of our civilization," said the human. "We recognize bodily autonomy as a fundamental right. Some choose to remain biologically standard. We've developed technologies that accommodate interaction across the full spectrum of human variation." The explorer-class human floated forward slightly. "I can directly interface with networks used by unmodified humans. My perceptual systems automatically adjust to communicate effectively with any human variant. The goal isn't to replace basic humanity, but to expand what humanity can be." The committee chamber fell into what might be called thoughtful silence. If that concept could encompass 17 different species, processing information through biological, quantum, and electromagnetic means simultaneously, it was the myth representative who finally vocalized what several were thinking. "Your approach effectively bypasses the biological ceiling we discussed during your initial assembly introduction." "Yes," confirmed the human representative. "Rather than hitting that ceiling and stopping, we've built upon it. We're not abandoning our biological foundation, we're using it as a launching platform." "A crude metaphor," observed the Thexal chairperson, "but not inaccurate." The explorer-class human smiled again. "If I might offer an observation, many of your species have evolved remarkable specialized adaptations over millions of years. We admire these achievements greatly, but specialization can become limitation when circumstances change. Our approach prioritizes adaptability itself as the ultimate evolutionary advantage." "And yet," countered the Voluth representative, "there must be costs to such rapid transformation. Cultural discontinuity, psychological adjustment issues, identity crises." "Of course," the human acknowledged. "We've faced all these challenges and more. Several of our earlier augmentation paths proved unsustainable. We've had to develop entirely new fields of psychology to address the cognitive implications of radical self-modification. Our philosophical and ethical frameworks have undergone multiple revolutions to accommodate our changing nature." "And still you persist in this chaotic approach?" asked the chorus representative. "Symmetrical appendages vibrating in harmonious disapproval." The augmented human answered this time. "We persist precisely because of the chaos, not despite it. Rigid evolutionary paths create species perfectly adapted to specific conditions. Until those conditions change, our messy, individualistic approach creates constant experimentation. For every augmentation path that fails, 3 more succeed in unexpected ways." The committee exchanged a series of communication pulses, too complex for the human translation matrices to fully capture. The subtle electromagnetic equivalent of resigned sighs filled the chamber. "We will need to reconsider the traditional evolutionary metrics used in assembly membership evaluation," the Thexal chairperson finally acknowledged. "Your species appears to have changed the parameters of the equation." As the human delegation departed, the explorer-class human lingering momentarily in the doorway with an enigmatic smile, the committee found itself confronting an uncomfortable possibility. Perhaps evolution itself was evolving, and they had been too specialized to notice. Meanwhile, across assembly space, the news of human augmentation technologies was spreading. Several younger species had already submitted formal requests for technological exchange protocols. The ancient Actel conclave, who hadn't modified their evolutionary approach in 6 million years, had reportedly called an emergency convention. The universe might indeed have a sense of humor, but perhaps more importantly, it never stopped changing the rules of its own game. 7 galactic cycles after humans demonstrated their augmentation technology, before the Assembly even finished drafting their report on this evolutionary curiosity, disaster struck. The Void Cascade, a phenomenon where space itself collapsed, began consuming entire star systems in the Sagittarius arm. The Assembly's emergency protocols activated for the first time in 18 million years. Representatives converged on headquarters, offering their specialized evolutionary solutions with increasing desperation. Our harmonic stabilizers can realign quantum fluctuations, proposed the chorus. Our gravitic manipulators can adjust space-time curvature, offered the Voce. Each species presented technologies exquisitely refined over millions of years, none designed for a threat that hadn't previously existed. By the third day, as the 4th star system vanished, the human delegation arrived with several distinctly different augmented variants: a quantum interface human with metallic skin, a constantly shifting flux-adapted variant, and a phase-dimensional specialist whose form seemed to exist partially in another dimension. "This is hardly the time for demonstrations," the Volith representative began. "On the contrary," interrupted the quantum interface human, "this is precisely the time. The Void Cascade isn't matter disappearing, it's being translocated to a parallel dimensional state in a reinforcing feedback loop." "That's impossible," objected the Krith. The partially third phase-dimensional human shimmered slightly. "I would beg to differ." "What's your solution?" demanded the facilitator. "We need to create a dimensional anchor point," explained the human representative. "Our phase-dimensional specialists can establish the initial reference frame, but we'll need to amplify the effect. That's where we need your technologies, repurposed and combined." "You want us to modify technologies we've spent millions of years perfecting?" The chorus representative was aghast. "Yes," replied the flux-adapted human bluntly, "because the alternative is watching them disappear along with everything else." The debate might have continued indefinitely had the Void Cascade not accelerated dramatically, engulfing an inhabited system. 70 billion sentient beings vanished instantly. In the shocked silence, even the most conservative assembly members reconsidered. Species came forward one by one, offering their unique capabilities. The next 60 hours passed in chaotic collaboration. Quantum interface humans reconfigured Quorus harmonic technologies. Flux-adapted variants worked with Vosek gravitic engineers. At the center, phase-dimensional humans established the crucial reference point. It was inelegant and plagued by setbacks. Technologies designed to work in isolation clashed. Translation issues led to dangerous miscalculations. Yet each time problems emerged, the humans adapted, literally, their augmented forms shifting to accommodate new requirements. Where specialized technologies proved incompatible, they developed interfaces on the fly. When theoretical models failed, they improvised approaches that defied conventional understanding. And when the Void Cascade finally reached the intervention zone, it gradually slowed. The dimensional fluctuations stabilized, the crisis passed. Days later, the exhausted assembly reconvened in their now cluttered chamber, where equipment from a dozen species created a chaotic laboratory where ceremonial space had once existed. "We have witnessed something unprecedented," noted the facilitator. "It wasn't elegant," admitted the human representative, It wasn't perfect, but it worked. The Explorer-class human offered a final observation. The threat couldn't have been anticipated by any single evolutionary path. It required capabilities no species would naturally evolve because the selection pressure never existed until now. As the assembly began rebuilding, their view of humanity shifted. The chaotic, individualistic approach to evolution, once dismissed as primitive, now appeared as a different kind of advancement, one that prioritized adaptability itself over any specific adaptation. In the aftermath of the Void Cascade, the Grand Assembly of evolved species found itself in the unprecedented position of questioning its most fundamental assumptions. The Crystal Headquarters, now bearing the scars of improvised modifications and emergency retrofitting, hosted a special convention unlike any in its multi-million-year history. "Order!" called the facilitator, whose ethereal form had finally recovered its usual compositional stability. "We convene today to address the implications of recent events." The chamber, hastily restored to some semblance of its former grandeur, nevertheless retained evidence of its recent transformation. Mismatched equipment from various species still occupied corners where ceremonial artifacts had once stood. Improvised power conduits had been tidied but not removed, their utility now acknowledged over aesthetic considerations. "The Void Cascade has been contained," continued the facilitator, "but its effects extend beyond physical damage. We face philosophical questions about the very nature of evolutionary advancement." The assembled representatives of species that had guided their own evolution with meticulous care over millions of years, shifted uncomfortably. For beings who measured change in geological timescales, the past few weeks represented an evolutionary blink of an eye that somehow managed to challenge eons of established wisdom. "The Evolutionary Paradigms Committee has prepared a preliminary report," announced the Thuxul chairperson, their consciousness coalescing into a more defined pattern than usual. "Our findings are unexpected." The report projected into the shared perceptual field of all attendees simultaneously. Species who communicated through visual means saw elegant diagrams, those who processed information chemically received tailored molecular patterns, and those who thought in quantum states perceived probability distributions. The Assembly's translation systems had evolved to accommodate all. "As you can see," continued the chairperson, "we have been forced to reconsider our definition of evolutionary success. Traditional metrics valued specialized adaptation, morphological optimization, and biological efficiency. By these standards, humans ranked among the least evolved spacefaring species." A ripple of something between amusement and discomfort passed through the gathering. "However," the chairperson continued, "when faced with the unprecedented threat of the Void Cascade, these traditional metrics proved inadequate. Specialized adaptations, while impressive, lacked the flexibility to address novel challenges." The human delegation, seated in what had once been a less prestigious section of the chamber, but was now centrally positioned, maintained carefully neutral expressions. Their augmented variants were noticeably absent, having returned to their research facilities to study the contained cascade phenomenon. "The Commissar Committee proposes a new evolutionary metric," announced the Third Sal, "one that measures meta-adaptive capacity, the ability to adapt to the unexpected, to develop new adaptations in response to novel selection pressures." "This is absurd," objected the chorus representative, their perfectly symmetrical features arranged in an expression of disapproval. "You propose to redefine eons of evolutionary theory based on a single anomalous event?" "Not a single event," countered the myth representative, whose youthful species had been taking detailed notes throughout the crisis. "A pattern. Our analysis shows 17 previous galactic-scale events where specialized adaptations proved insufficient. In each case, species with greater flexibility ultimately fared better than those with more refined but rigid capabilities. "Are you suggesting," asked the Vosek representative, fractal tentacles twisting in agitation, "that our evolutionary paths have been misguided?" "Not misguided," intervened the human representative, rising to address the assembly. "Simply optimized for stability rather than volatility. Your evolutionary approaches perfected adaptations to known conditions, an entirely rational strategy in a relatively consistent universe. And yet," countered the Tlikali ambassador, "when conditions changed dramatically, those perfected adaptations became limitations." "Precisely," agreed the human, "which is why we chose a different path. Humans recognized our biological limitations early in our development. Our bodies weren't particularly fast, strong, or durable compared to other Earth species. But we realized something crucial. The ability to adapt quickly to new challenges was more valuable than any specific adaptation." "So you chose to not evolve?" asked a junior delegate from a newly spacefaring species, clearly struggling with the concept. The human smiled. "On the contrary, we chose to evolve differently. Instead of relying on the slow generational process of biological evolution, we developed technology that allowed us to adapt within a single lifetime. Rather than specializing, we diversified. Instead of optimizing for current conditions, we optimized for change itself." The chamber fell silent as species across the evolutionary spectrum contemplated this perspective. "The Void Cascade demonstrated the value of this approach," observed the Tethal chairperson. "While our specialized technologies could not address the threat individually, humans were able to rapidly integrate and repurpose them into a functional solution." "Which raises an uncomfortable question," added the myth representative. "Should we reconsider our own evolutionary paths?" This question, once unthinkable, now hung in the chamber like a gravitational distortion, pulling at the foundations of civilizations that had defined themselves by their evolutionary choices. It was the ancient Actal conclave, whose last evolutionary modification predated Earth's formation, that broke the silence. Their representative, a being so technologically subtle that they appeared as little more than a controlled perturbation in the fabric of reality, addressed the assembly for the first time in 50,000 years. "Perhaps," they said, their translated thoughts appearing as patterns of meaning rather than discrete words, "evolution itself evolves." The profound simplicity of this observation resonated throughout the chamber. Species that had once dismissed humans as evolutionary underachievers now recognized something their specialized paths had overlooked. Evolution wasn't merely about perfecting adaptations to existing conditions, but developing the capacity to adapt to conditions that hadn't yet emerged. In the months that followed, the assembly witnessed an unprecedented wave of interspecies collaboration. The chorus began experimenting with asymmetrical technologies that sacrificed perfection for flexibility. The Vosek established research initiatives to study human augmentation approaches. Even the ancient Klikani, whose evolutionary path had remained unchanged for millions of years, cautiously began exploring alternative adaptations. Humans, for their part, freely shared their technological evolution frameworks, while eagerly learning from the specialized biological achievements of other species. Explorer-class humans could now be found on dozens of worlds, studying evolutionary approaches they might incorporate into their constantly expanding definition of humanity. As for the Grand Assembly itself, its rigid hierarchical structure based on evolutionary advancement underwent its own adaptation. New metrics valued diverse approaches, collaborative potential, and adaptive flexibility, alongside traditional specialization. The facilitator, observing these changes with the perspective of a being who had witnessed the rise and fall of numerous galactic civilizations, found a certain cosmic humor in the situation. The species that had refused to evolve in the traditional sense had triggered an evolutionary leap in galactic civilization itself. Perhaps the universe did have a sense of humor after all, or perhaps it simply favored those who understood that the only constant was change itself.